Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something many find both perplexing and deeply concerning: addiction.
It's the big topic.
Definitely. And you, our listener, often tell us you're looking for a clear, efficient path through complicated subjects. That's what we aim for here, exploring the core of what addiction really is.
Right. And to help us navigate this, we've got a couple of sources. First, there's the Wikipedia entry on addiction, pretty comprehensive, gives a broad base.
Okay.
And second, an article from the HMP Global Learning Network. This one looks at something interesting: how everyday coping mechanisms can sometimes, well, blur the line with addictive behaviors.
Okay. So our mission today is to pull out the key insights, right? Understand addiction not just as like a willpower issue, but biologically, psychologically.
And behaviorally, too. Plus, looking at how those seemingly normal ways we cope might become ingrained habits.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's unpack this then. Where do we start? What's the fundamental understanding of addiction today?
Fundamentally, it's understood as a neuropsychological disorder.
Neuropsychological. Sounds very sciencey.
It does, but basically means it involves both the brain and our behavior.
Mm-hmm.
The key thing is this really strong, persistent urge.
An urge to do something.
Yeah, something that feels rewarding. Could be a substance, could be an activity. And this continues even when it's causing, serious harm, negative consequences.
So it's not just about someone lacking strength then, not just pull yourself together.
Not at all. The brain plays a huge role.
Mm-hmm.
Repeatedly engaging in these behaviors or using substances actually changes how brain cells talk to each other.
Changes the connections.
Right, the synapses. It's kind of like
Right.
rewiring. And these changes, they actually mirror what happens with natural rewards, food, affection, that sort of thing.
Wow.
And this contributes to those intense cravings.
Yeah.
And it weakens self-control, especially maybe if someone's already a bit more vulnerable.
That sounds incredibly complex. Is it purely biological then? Just brain chemistry?
Well, no, not entirely. The biology is critical, absolutely. That's why we call it a brain disorder.
Yeah.
But it's really woven together with psychological factors, social factors.
So nature and nurture, basically.
Exactly. It's how our brain wiring interacts with our individual psychology and our environment. It's all connected.
What about those animal studies? The ones with mice and cocaine we sometimes hear about. What do they tell us?
Yes. Those studies, they've given us valuable insights, especially into the compulsive nature at a basic level. They show animals will keep seeking substances even when it's bad for them.
Okay.
But human addiction is, well, much more layered. You've got complex behaviors, personality traits, things animal models just can't fully capture.
That makes sense. Humans are definitely messy. So when we talk about addiction, is it always drugs and alcohol, I mean?
Good question. Substance addiction specifically refers to that persistent use of drugs, including alcohol, despite the harm. And within that, there are several related ideas worth grasping. Well, like addictive drug. That's first, psychoactive substance affects the mind. That's highly likely to lead to a substance use disorder because of how powerfully it hits the brain's reward system.
Okay. And we hear terms like dependence and tolerance thrown around a lot.
Right. Dependence is when your body adapts to having the substance around constantly because you've used it repeatedly.
So if you stop suddenly.
To get withdrawal symptoms.
Yeah.
Exactly. Then there's also drug sensitization, sometimes called reverse tolerance.
Reverse tolerance, what's that?
It's where the drug's effect actually gets stronger with repeated use, even at the same dose. Kind of counterintuitive.
Oh, weird.
Yeah. And then drug withdrawal itself just refers to those unpleasant symptoms when someone stops using after repeated use.
And is there a difference between physical and psychological dependence?
Yes. Physical dependence involves those noticeable body symptoms when you stop, like shaking, sweating with alcohol withdrawal.
Okay, I can picture that.
Psychological dependence is more about the emotional and mental side. Feeling apathetic, anxious, it can really mess with thinking and concentration.
Got it. What about reinforcing versus rewarding stimuli? Are they different?
They're related, but yes, slightly different. Reinforcing stimuli make you more likely to repeat the behaviors linked to them.
Like training a dog.
Kind of. And rewarding stimuli are things the brain sees as inherently positive, desirable, things we want to seek out. Addictive stuff is usually both.
Okay. The drug is the reward, and it also makes you want to seek it again.
Precisely. It's reinforcing the seeking behavior because it's rewarding.
And sensitization, again. You mentioned reverse tolerance.
Sensitization is the broader term for just an amplified response to something after you've been exposed repeatedly. Reverse tolerance is just one type related to drug effects getting stronger.
Okay.
Then you have substance use disorder. That's the clinical diagnosis when use causes significant problems. And tolerance is the opposite of sensitization. The drug effect gets weaker, so you need more.
That's quite a glossary. So, putting it together, drug addiction,
Hmm.
how's that defined more precisely?
Right. Drug addiction. It falls under substance-related disorders. It's seen as a chronic, relapsing brain disorder,
Yeah.
characterized by that intense, often uncontrollable drug seeking and use.
Even when things are clearly going wrong.
Exactly. Even with clear, harmful consequences. It fundamentally changes brain circuits, especially the reward system, affecting stress management, impulse control. It can be long-lasting.
And sadly, potentially fatal if untreated, right?
Tragically, yes, due to organ damage and other complications.
And it's not just illicit drugs, is it?
No, definitely not. It ranges from things like alcohol and nicotine
Very common substances.
to marijuana, opioids, cocaine, amphetamines.
Yeah.
And there's growing recognition that even high-fat, high-sugar foods might have addictive potential for some.
Really? Food?
Yeah. The way it hits the reward system can be similar for certain individuals, and how it starts varies hugely: social use, prescriptions, other coping mechanisms.
Okay. Let's shift gears a bit. The neuropsychological aspects. Our source mentioned the trans-theoretical model of change, TTM.
Ah, yes, the TTM. It's a really useful way to think about how people view their addiction and, crucially, how ready they are to change. It's not usually an overnight switch.
So it's like stages?
Exactly. Stages like pre-contemplation, maybe not even seeing the problem, then contemplation, thinking about it,
Yeah.
then preparation, action, maintenance. It maps out that gradual process.
That makes a lot of sense. People are definitely in different places. It also mentioned cognitive control versus stimulus control. What's the difference there?
Okay, so this is about internal versus external drivers of behavior. Cognitive control is our internal ability to intentionally choose thoughts, actions, emotions, like deciding not to eat the cookie.
My internal ability that often fails with cookies.
Ah, right. And stimulus control is external. Cues in the environment triggering automatic behaviors through conditioning, like the smell of coffee making you want a cup.
Gotcha. Internal choice versus external trigger.
And these two are always kind of competing for control over what we do.
How does that play out in addiction?
Well, in addiction, that internal cognitive control often gets weaker, especially the ability to inhibit impulses to hit the brakes.
Okay.
At the same time, responses driven by external stimulus control, those cues linked to the reward, become much stronger, much more dominant.
So the go signal from the trigger gets louder and the stop signal from inside gets quieter.
That's a great way to put it. And interestingly, this difficulty with impulse control, it's also seen in things like ADHD.
So the brain's natural brake system gets overridden.
Pretty much. And this brings us to how drugs actually affect the brain. Our sources explain they can change both function and physical structure.
Structure too, wow.
Yes, and this impacts learning, memory, impulse control, often in ways that unfortunately encourage more use and make stopping harder.
And dopamine.
But
That always comes up. What's its specific role?
dopamine is absolutely key. It's a neurotransmitter in the brain's reward pathway. Normally, it's released during pleasurable activities, even essential ones like eating, motivating us to repeat them.
Makes sense.
Addictive drugs cause a massive surge in dopamine, way more than natural rewards. This huge dopamine signal drives that reward seeking, motivates more drug use, and forms those really strong maladaptive drug-cue connections.
So even early drug use can start forging these powerful links in the brain.
Exactly. Those early experiences can create strong associations between the drug and intense pleasure, making it much harder later for the brain's cognitive control to win out against cravings.
That's sobering. Our sources also get into genetics and environment. How do they fit in?
Both are really significant. Genetics definitely plays a role. Twin studies show that identical twins are more likely to share an addiction than fraternal twins.
Suggesting a genetic link.
Right. And family studies show higher risk if close relatives have addiction issues.
Are there specific addiction genes then?
It's complicated. Research on common gene variations often finds they only contribute a small risk increase. So there's this rare variant hypothesis. Maybe less common genes have a bigger impact for some people.
Okay.
These genome-wide association studies, GWAS, look broadly. Interestingly, they sometimes point to genes involved in things like cell adhesion, not necessarily the ones highlighted by animal models.
Huh. So it's not straightforward.
Not at all. And these genes might influence the brain before or after drug experiences. Plus, we can't forget the environment.
Right, that must be huge.
Absolutely critical. You see massive differences in drug use patterns between countries, or even in the same place over time. Social and cultural factors are powerful.
So how do genes and environment interact?
That's where epigenetics comes in. It's a fascinating field. It studies how the environment can actually change how our genes are expressed without changing the DNA code itself.
Like dimmer switches on the genes.
That's a perfect analogy. Environmental factors can turn those switches up or down. It helps bridge that gap between inherited risk and environmental influence.
Wow, okay, let's shift to the psychological angle. What do the sources say there?
Well, one perspective comes from psychoanalytic theory. It views addiction partly as a defense against deep feelings, like hopelessness or helplessness.
A defense mechanism.
Sort of. Or maybe a symptom of struggling to regulate emotions, potentially linked to adverse childhood experiences or ACEs. The substance offers temporary relief, a feeling of control.
In the ACE study, that seems relevant to so many things.
It really does. That study showed a strong link between the number of ACEs someone experiences things like abuse, neglect, household instability, and later problems, including a much higher risk of substance use disorder.
Why is that?
Chronic childhood stress can disrupt healthy brain development. It can impair cognitive functions, coping skills, making substance use seem like a way to cope, or reducing impulse control, especially in adolescence.
It sounds like a really tough cycle.
It can be. And sources also mention environmental factors in teen years, like friends using drugs or family conflict, also increase risk.
What about when addiction occurs alongside other mental health issues, like depression or anxiety?
That's very common. Comorbidity, they call it. People with depression, anxiety, ADHD, PTSD, they have a significantly higher risk of substance use disorders.
Is it cause and effect or just linked?
It's complex, likely goes both ways.
Mhm.
NIDEA also points to things like early aggressive behavior as a risk factor. And the National Bureau of Economic Research found a definite connection with high rates of alcohol, cocaine, and cigarette use among mental health patients.
So underlying all this, what are the core brain mechanisms making addiction happen?
Fundamentally, it's a disorder of the brain's reward system. It develops through genetic changes, transcriptional and epigenetic, caused by chronic exposure to addictive stimuli.
And not just drugs, right? You mentioned food, other things.
Right, drugs, food, sex, gambling. And a key player in this process, a critical gene transcription factor, is called delta FOSB.
Delta FOSB, okay.
It seems to be a common factor in virtually all forms of behavioral and drug addictions, like a molecular switch.
A switch, how so?
Well, research shows that having too much FOSB produced in specific brain cells in the nucleus accumbens, a key reward area, is linked to developing and intensifying compulsive behavior.
So it directly drives the compulsion.
It seems to. It's even being looked at as a potential biomarker for addiction because the link is so direct. It ramps up drug seeking, makes rewards more enticing. It's positive reinforcement, but it also makes you less sensitive to the downsides, the aversion.
Wow, that's a powerful combination. Double trouble.
Exactly. A real 1-2 punch in the brain.
Okay, switching to a more hopeful note, potential treatment innovations. What's new?
There was a really interesting recent study in the journal Addiction. It suggested that certain medications, GLP-1 agonists like semaglutide,
The ones used for diabetes and weight loss, Ozempic and Wegovy.
those are the ones. The study suggested that it might actually reduce the risk of overdose and alcohol intoxication to people with substance use disorders.
Seriously, how did they find that?
They analyzed health records for nearly 9 years, over 1 million people. They found folks with opioid or alcohol use disorders taking these meds had a significantly lower risk, like 40% lower for opioid overdose, 50% lower for alcohol intoxication compared to those not taking them.
That's incredible. A diabetes drug helping with addiction risk.
Yeah, potentially mind-blowing, really unexpected connection, but potentially very significant.
Definitely something to watch. What about tools for actually identifying addiction? How do professionals screen for it?
There are quite a few tools. The addictions neuroclinical assessment looks at things like executive function, how appealing the substance is, negative emotions.
Okay.
There's the TAP-ES tool, tobacco, alcohol, prescription medication, and other substance use for screening and risk level. For teens, the CRAF-FFT tool looks at use, driving risks, and includes some brief counseling points.
Right.
Then there's the DAS-10, a self-report questionnaire on problematic use, and the ASSIST test from the WHO, which is interview-based.
So, multiple ways to assess the situation. What about prevention? Anything new there? Like stopping it before it starts?
Well, one really intriguing area is addiction vaccines. People have been working on this since the early 2000s.
Vaccines against addiction? How would that even work?
The basic idea is to train your immune system to see the drug molecule as an enemy, attack it, and disable it before it reaches the brain and causes its effects.
Wow. What drugs are they targeting?
Things like nicotine, opioids, fentanyl. The potential advantages are long duration. It's been administered, maybe less organ toxicity.
Are any close?
There have been specific ones in development. Nicvex for nicotine, TACD for cocaine, THUs also for nicotine. And as of late 2023, reports mentioned testing vaccines against heroin and fentanyl, with OxyContin possibly next.
Using our own immune system. That's fascinating.
It really is a completely different approach.
And for people already struggling, what are the standard treatment approaches today?
Effective treatment is almost always a combo platter. You often combine pharmacological approaches, medications, with other things.
Like therapy.
Exactly. CBT, DBT, individual or group therapy, behavior modification, 12-step programs, maybe residential treatment. And remember that trans-theoretical model.
The stages of change.
Right. That helps tailor the approach to where the person actually is in their readiness to change. You meet them where they are.
Okay. Now, that second source from HMP Global, it connected everyday coping mechanisms and habit formation to addiction. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this was really thought-provoking. It highlights how behaviors we start using just to cope with stress or discomfort can become learned responses through repetition.
Like habits.
Exactly. When we repeat them without conscious thought, they become habits. The article uses locking your car door as an analogy.
Okay. How does that work?
Well, you feel discomfort. The car's at risk. You perform the behavior locking it, and you get a reward feeling safe. It becomes automatic.
Right. I do that without thinking. Lots of things, actually.
We all do. The parallel to addiction is this. The coping behavior, maybe using a substance or some other activity, meets a need for a reward, often relief from distress.
Ah, so the relief is the reward.
Yes. And the big concern for addiction professionals is when this habituation happens with behaviors that are inherently rewarding or involve substances hitting that reward pathway hard, they can become deeply ingrained, automatic.
And potentially slide into addiction.
Exactly. It blurs that line. It suggests it's not just about chasing intense highs, but also about that repeated seeking of comfort or relief through these habituated coping mechanisms.
So even trying to manage everyday stress, if the method is rewarding enough and repeated often.
It could potentially lead down that same path, involving the same kind of brain changes we see in substance addiction. It really broadens the picture.
It certainly does. This has been a really thorough deep dive. Complex stuff. Let's try and summarize the key takeaways for you listeners.
Okay. I think we've seen addiction as this really complex mix. There's the biology brain changes, there's psychology coping, past experiences, there are genetics vulnerability, and the environment plays a huge role.
Right. It impacts the brain's reward system, motivation, impulse control.
Hugely. And, importantly, as we just discussed, even seemingly normal coping strategies, if they become habituated around a reward, can get tangled up in this.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. Given everything we've covered, I really encourage you, our listener, take a moment. Which parts of this resonated most with how you understood addiction before?
Yeah, what clicked, or maybe what challenged your view. And that leads us to a final thought to leave you with.
Okay.
Given how central reward is in addiction, but also just informing everyday habits, what are some of the subtle ways reward might be shaping your own behaviors? Both the helpful ones.
Maybe the ones that could potentially be less helpful or even harmful in the long run.
Exactly. Something to ponder.
That is a powerful question. Definitely food for thought. We hope you'll explore the resources mentioned or dig deeper into anything that sparked your interest today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.